haven't, then effectively they failed in a particular aspect of their performance. Similarly, if you wait an hour and a half, you know there's something wrong, and suddenly your level of your perception of their level of performance is dropping. This is a terrible place. They don't know how to run it. I came in here for a pizza, and here I am an hour and a half later, and it hasn't turned up. So even with a pizza, it's far better to actually write down what it is that we've ordered. Anyway, how do you know? Well, just to summarise, so to put it back into this technical term, so what did we order? The scope, the specification, how much it was for is the consideration. We talked a little bit about performance in terms of time, but as we know that isn't necessarily written down. We need to know what it is that we've added as extras, and that needs to be written down. And then another major reason why we set out these obligations in contracts is that we want to have a remedy. We've got to be able to find some way of achieving compensation if something goes wrong. And that process of compensation, of course, has to be enforceable too. Otherwise, you wouldn't really want a contract in the first place. So that call the manager moment, when you're looking for a remedy, or maybe a refund, or something, a percentage off your next visit. And you can see there that that's what we do naturally. We naturally negotiate. It's a bit uncomfortable, especially there's a little bit of tension there. And that's is sometimes also why, when the stakes get bigger, that we will begin to use another professional to do that, to do that negotiation for us. A legal professional, normally a solicitor, or if we went to court, a barrister. So there always has to be some sort of provision for what happens when things go wrong. How do you resolve a dispute? And in this, again, is another example of where you as consumers have particular rights. Okay, so let's now, having covered the principles, having thought about how we can contextualize a contract in terms of our pizza meal, think about a contract structure. So now we're sort of going to move for the rest of this session to a sort of more formal approach to contracts. And I suppose this is the area in particular that Peter will be interested in and you'll be interested in when it comes to assessment. I suspect you won't get exam questions around pizzas. I have a funny feeling, but if you do, well, you'll know what the answers will be. Okay. But what we're initially looking for is, say, this written agreement. So now we move from our pizza to building a house of some sort. And so builder contractors agrees to build a house for X sum of money, start £400,000 in this case, starting on a particular date and completing on another. So that is the agreement. And you can see just within that sentence, we've got most of the elements we require. We know who the two people are that are setting up these obligations, or the two organisations. In this case, the contractor is Builder Contractors. That's one side of the transaction, and Mr. Tracy is on the other side of the transaction. The consideration, the performance, is the new house. That's what Build It are going to do, and £400,000. That's what Mr. Tracy's going to pay. And because time is an important aspect of our performance, we've also got a start and completion date. So just within that sentence, we have everything we need to make an agreement. The problem, of course, we have is we don't quite, that sentence doesn't really give us enough detail. So it's a little bit like our menu when we go into our pizza restaurant. There is no detail at this point. So we have to have a set of details, and we call those terms of conditions. Most of them are what we call explicit. They're written down. So again, this goes back to the point of we want to have our agreements in writing. It could be written down, but of course there are drawings, there are specifications, there are schedules of work. All of those things, if they're referred to in the contract, and they should be, those details are the details that sit below that headline sentence, new house, £400,000. So we would expect to see, a set of drawings, how the building's made, what it's made of, what the details are, maybe even down to the colours of things. But of course, just thinking about the point I made earlier about how we need to be able to change things, very often, of course, you won't have agreed every little detail right at that outset, so in those explicit terms. And so there has to be some provision to change things. So that's straightforward, our explicit terms. But we also have what are called implied terms, and these are implied by law or by statute. So this is, again, up to now, so those, the written agreement, the explicit terms, are things that you and we've created, and that's the private law. But the English legal system says that's probably not enough. We need other things in place as well that maybe you haven't written down. So a fairly obvious one, in the case of our pizza, is it has to be edible. Nowhere is it going to be written down. There is an assumption, an implied term as it's called, that will be the case, that it will be fit for consumption. And similarly, if we're building our house, it will be built so that it is fit for its purpose. Fit for its purpose as a house, not as something else. Now that may not be written down, but English law steps in and says, I think we need to make that clear. And so there's legislation that will have that written down. Now you don't necessarily have to refer to it in your contract, it's what's called it's implied. So it's part of a legal framework, it assumes that the English law will apply, and in this particular case, it's built, an example might be that it's built so as to be fit for its purpose. And I've just referred to those other documents, the schedules and the drawings. So all of those things go up to make the contract. So yes, we have this headline, but we also have these other elements that make up the details of the contract in the same way that you have got your menu in your restaurant. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit. So we've now got to the principles of what would be in those contracts. And then finally, I'm just going to talk a little bit about building contracts as well. So I mentioned that obviously we have to have this set of obligations, this contractor-employer relationship. So the headline, what I'm going to call the headline contract, the main contract, is the two boxes in the middle at the top. So the example of Build It contractors and Mr. Tracy. Mr. Tracy's employer, Build It contractors are the contractors. So the arrow that flows between the two of them is that agreement to build a house for £400,000. But the contractor doesn't just build that by themselves. They normally will employ what we call domestic subcontractors, other contractors that sit below them, and they manage that process. We call them domestic subcontractors because they're domestic in a sense to the main contractor. But you needn't worry too much about that word. The key thing is that they are subcontractors, and you can see their work feeds into the main contract. Sitting next to this main contract and employer structure is the architect. And the architect is what we call contract administrator, in this case in a traditional contract. So you can see that there are two contracts going on here. There's the main one between the employer and the main contractor, And then we have a professional services contractor, the services we provide as architects to our client. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier that there is also this other role that we take on. We may act as the employer's what we call agent. We may do certain things that would normally take place within the contract. And the way we organise these is that the architect will perform certain services that the employer would normally be expected to perform. And those are written down in the contract because it's an exception to this rule of privity of contract. We set those particular roles out, and it could be either agency. We don't need to worry too much about that. A longer word there, adjudicatory. But the contract administrator has two functions. One, to act on behalf of the client, but also another role is to decide any claim that the contractor may have made, and to do that in an independent fashion. So part of our everyday role as architects in a traditional contract relationship is not only to design the works, but also to what's called administer the terms of the building contract. And we do that on behalf of the employer. We're literally stepping into their shoes because they're either too busy, they don't have the expertise. So an example of that might be we want to change something, or the employer wants to change something. Change the colour, maybe, of the walls. It will be the architect, as contract administrator, acting as the employer's agent, who instructs the main contractor to make that change. Similarly, if there's a dispute about payment or dispute about delay in the works, that performance aspect, the employer is not expected to make a decision about that claim. The architect acts on their behalf, but does so also in an independent way. They weigh up the merits of a claim and then make a decision. Just also for completeness, you'll see that, going back to that other principle I referred to called privity of contract, where the burdens and benefits can only relate to the people connected by the arrows, effectively, by the contracts themselves. Note that because the main contractor has relationships with these other subcontractors, there is no, and that's where the direct relationship occurs. Neither the architect nor the employer has any power anywhere to instruct one of these three people, because there is no contractual relationship. They can't vary their work, they can't change it. It has to be the main contractor who does that. So another example might be if one of these domestic subcontractors doesn't get paid, they don't have recourse, they can't go straight to the employer for payment because there is no contractual relationship there. So if just to expand on that simple diagram, and we'll relate to this in terms of the terms that we've used before around agreements. And now I'm just going to get into a little bit more detail, I suppose. In a traditional building contract, the architect designs the project and the contractor builds it. And the contractor does that for the employer, your client. So fairly straightforward. So the agreement, as I said, was between Build It and Mr. Tracy. And in this case, it could have started in April last year, finished in December. That's the agreement. We also, to be clear, we have what are called, and this is the technical term, the legal term, what we call recitals. We recite effectively who does what, who is the architect, stroke contract administrator, who is the employer. I mentioned earlier as well, we work as a team. There'll be engineers, there'll be cost consultants, there'll be structural engineers, maybe road engineers, services engineers, drainage. All of those people might be referred to in the contract, but none of them have the same role as the architect and contract administrator, unless the contract's been changed to say that they have. But normally, although there are all these other people in the contractual team and the design team, none of them have the power to instruct the main contractor to make changes. All of those things have to come through the architect as contract administrator. We talked about terms and conditions a little bit earlier, so the building contract has to have those. We've talked about drawings and schedules, so you would expect to find those. So here, as I say, just to summarise, is the architect is named as a contract administrator and they're given the power to act on behalf of the employer. And the way I would like you to think about this idea of an agent is literally you are stepping into somebody's shoes. You are, they would do the work if they could, but actually the contract now says you're going to do it for them instead. And you're not only stepping into their shoes, but you're also their eyes and ears as their agent and resolve any claims. So this slide, there's one slide to remember. It's this one summarises what those roles and responsibilities are and how these contracts are made up. So we don't need to go into the technical detail of a building contract. Many building contracts are standard form of building contract, which is the equivalent to, in a sense, a standard menu in a restaurant. Standard building contract is about 125 pages long. And we would never expect anybody to memorize those, but the principles are that are all set, those 125 pages contain all of these things. I should say it's not just that, as well as the 125 pages, you've got all the drawings, the specifications, you have a pile of information as well as that contract that sits on top. But the agreement is that one line, that headline that says who the two people are that are making these obligations, how much it's for, and then when it's going to start and when it's going to finish. Okay. I think Peter's also asked me to talk about another set of relationships. So many contracts, many obligations are set up in this traditional way, that traditional contract. But we also operate in another environment where we have design and build contracts. So, if we go back to the pizza analogy, you're not expecting when you go and into a restaurant to somehow find there to be a separate chef that's acting for you, that's designing your meal for you, and then asking the restaurant to prepare it. That would be a bizarre example. It probably can happen, but it wouldn't. Normally you're expecting the restaurant to design the menu and then deliver it. So the equivalent, and that really is the default position. All those services to do with how they put the menu together, the food they deliver, and how they deliver it is combined into one role. Now obviously the scale and complexity are very different. So we can't sort of stretch this analogy too far. But the principles are the same. Now buildings are complex, so that's why we tend to have these traditional roles where the architect acts for the client and also acts as their agent when it comes to the construction. So the two contracts. Design and build operates in a different way. We've still got this headline contract, the two boxes in the middle at the top, and we've still got these other boxes at the bottom where I call them works package contractors here, where there are other subcontractors who do the work. We also have the architect up there as the employer's representative, so we have conventional design team arrangement. But at some point, the design is developed by the people in that box on the left, the contractor's design team. And at some point, the contractor then takes responsibility for not just building the work, but also designing it. So in terms of their performance, in terms of setting out the services and the products they're going to provide, these will now include some of the services that you would have provided as architect, in particular the detailed design. You should also see that there isn't that diagonal arrow any longer. There is no relationship between you as the employer's representative and architect and the design and build contractor. There is no agency role. You're not stepping into your employer's shoes. You're just allowing the contractor to take on the full responsibility for developing the design and building it. So just to summarize that, there's still an agreement, but in this case the agreement says the contractor not just builds it but also designs it. So there is no longer the architect in the equation. And we could still have that headline agreement, but in this case you're paying for the design and build starting on such and such a date. And it still has all the other things. We could say that the architect also works for the contractor. So there's the opportunity for the architect to move across and work for the contractor. But there is also, as we say, an employer's representative, so the terminology changes slightly, and that employer's representative, who could be the architect, is named and given very limited powers to act on behalf of the client. So the design and build contract, in principle, does, just to summarise, does a few things. The first does a few things. The first one is it shifts design responsibility to the contractor. So whereas in our first example you designed a building and the contractor built it on behalf for the employer, now the contractor says, I will take responsibility for both the design and the construction. So a fairly fundamental shift. So it's now a single point of responsibility for all the work. So a little bit like our pizza restaurant example, where the restaurant itself designs the pizza, designs the fillings, specifies it, they've tested it, they know it works, and then they deliver it. So you could see in many ways that design and build is in many ways a default. Might be considered a normal process. But the difference is that, of course, we're not providing a standard product all the time. Building contracts are complicated, and sometimes the client wants full representation from the architect. So that fundamental thing is that the contractor takes on responsibility the performance of the design and the construction, and they also now are what we call a one-stop shop for both of those services. And then secondly, the contract itself, and this I suppose is the detailed part of what I would say about design and build, is that the contract is written in a way to reduce the opportunities to make changes. So it's a much more constrained contract. Whereas I said one of the functions of the architect acting as agent is to make changes for the client, to add things, take things away, change colour, those sorts of things. Design and build contract, by shifting the design responsibility to the contractor, actually reduces the opportunities to make changes. There's an assumption that no change will be made. And when a change is made, it will normally be by agreement between the contractor and the employer. Okay, so just to summarise, again, just for these two examples, the architect prepares a detailed design for the employer in traditional contracts. Sorry, I should say traditional contracts. The architect prepares a detailed design, and then the contractor builds it. The architect administers the contract, so the contract administrator, and resolves claims impartially and fairly. In design and build, the architect will prepare the outline design for the client, and then the contractor takes responsibility for design development and the construction for the employer. So the architect is not involved in any of those contractual aspects. Okay, so what happens if it all goes wrong? Well, as I said, contracts have to be enforceable. If they go wrong, you need a remedy. And the terminology is, strictly speaking, if something goes wrong, it's called a breach of contract. Literally like a wall that's being broken, a sea wall that's allowing the water through. That container has been broken. And then you need a remedy, and we call the remedy damages. And the principle behind damages in contracts is to take you to the place you would be if all the performance that's written down in the contract, of all those elements of the performance, have been completed. So there isn't such thing as a penalty clause. You can't penalise contractors for not performing. You can only claim these damages that take you to the place you would have been if the contractor had done everything they said they'd do. Similarly, if the employer doesn't pay everything they're meant to pay, the contractor can only claim for the amount of money that was due. And obviously they might make a claim for additional money, and then you'll get a dispute. And a contract will have different routes for how you can resolve those disputes. And just very, very quickly, you can see this is a summary of what those routes may be. We talked a little bit at first about negotiation. If you were sitting in your restaurant and you didn't get what you wanted in time, or the side order didn't turn up, there might be an element of negotiation where they might knock something off the bill. And we negotiate on a daily basis. Most of the negotiations we do are not really around contracts. We do them with our friends. I'll agree to meet you at so-and-so. I might be 10 minutes late. That's a sense of negotiation. We might have what's called mediation. Mediation is where somebody helps you arrive at a solution. And then we have, in construction, we have what's called adjudication. So that's a formal route, and it's the normal default position in construction contracts after mediation. It's written into the contract, but it might not be. If it isn't written in, it's what's called an implied term. So the fact that you didn't include it in the contract, in the case of adjudication, doesn't mean you can't do it. Excuse the double negative. It's there as a provision. So, and the idea about adjudication is it's very quick. You resolve your dispute within either 28 or 42 days. And an adjudicator, who could be an architect, could be an engineer, could be a cost consultant, is the person who decides the dispute. Then you get to more lengthy methods of dispute resolution, arbitration, which is a private process. Very, very few construction contracts, domestic subcontracts, go to arbitration, probably fewer than 10 a year in the whole of the construction industry. Or litigation. And of course, when we think of resolving a dispute, somebody making a claim, we think of going to court. We think of litigation. But it's expensive and it's time consuming. And you'll see that actually only about 10% of disputes ever end up in court. So although we read about all these things in the newspaper, we hear about them, not so much construction contracts, there are some, but it's only the tip of the iceberg that actually end up in court. I'm not going to worry about this, but I just wanted to emphasize the dangers of oral agreements. Some of you who watch Formula One may recognize this guy, Eddie Jordan. The reason that he wanders up and down the pit lane now and doesn't run his own motor racing team is that he fell foul of what was called an oral agreement. He made an agreement over his phone, so he thought, for a 150 million sponsorship deal. The other party, Vodafone in this case, reneged on the deal. They said, no, you haven't got to deal with us. We never agreed to anything. He thought it was important enough to pursue it and went to court, and he lost. But it's just the dangers of, ironically, he was sitting in the back of his car at the time, so he was purely relying on that one sentence, you've got the deal, to confirm $150 million of sponsorship. And the judge said at the time, and we don't need to worry about it too much, but said, actually it's extremely unlikely that anybody like Vodafone, a mobile phone operator of such a size, would actually agree to that sort of sum of money for a deal just like that. And he lost the case, and it cost him £5 million just to take it to court. Okay, so just lastly we'll talk about the architect's appointment. I mentioned that we're not only do the laws of contract apply, but also we're subject to these rules set down by the Architects Registration Board and the RIBA. And in this case, I've quoted from the Architects Registration Board, which says, which gives you, and I'm not going to read this out, but what you must put in to your contract with your client. And you can see, of course, the bits I put in red are the bits that we've really talked about already. It's common sense. But the point they're trying to make is that your agreements must be in writing, and they must contain these different elements. And similarly, the RIBA has a code of conduct. At the moment, it's Principle 2, competence. And note here in both of these things, just check I've got the right one. Yes, I have, 2017. This is 2016 for the RIBA. Similarly, it covers the same points. Now, the RIBA's Code of Professional Conduct is in the process of being changed. I doubt if any of these things will change. But I just want to emphasize the point that we have to keep up to date with these matters. Okay, that's it. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope that that's given you an overview of our obligations that we set up, and how we make a contract, how we make it enforceable, and what the different elements are, and then how we can relate that to our restaurant experience, and then how we can translate that to what I call more professional matters, the agreements we make with our clients, and also how building contracts are formed, and then very briefly what happens when things go wrong, and then lastly this extra layer of another set of rules that the profession requires us to follow. Thank you very much.